Mozambique, a country tucked along the southeastern coast of Africa, holds within its borders a history soaked in resistance, revolution, and blood. It is a land where colonial scars meet post-colonial pain, where dreams of liberation clashed with brutal realities of power struggle. After centuries of Portuguese rule, the people of Mozambique finally tasted freedom in 1975. But their joy was short-lived. Just 2 years after independence, a civil war erupted that would last 15 long years. It would consume villages, divide families, and reshape the soul of a nation. Over 1 million people would die in one of the most devastating conflicts in post-colonial Africa. This was not just a war between two armies. It was a war fought in fields and forests, in schools and churches, in homes and refugee camps. It was a war between ideologies, between communism and capitalism, between global interests and local grievances. It was a war between FRELIMO and RENAMO, two forces claiming to fight for the people. But in the end, it was the people who suffered the most. This is the full story of the Mozambican Civil War. A war few remember, but no one who lived it can forget. Through this documentary, we will walk through the origins of conflict, the foreign hands that fueled the fire, the human suffering, and the long road to peace. We will hear the voices of those who fought, those who lost, and those who tried to rebuild. In 5 deep chapters, we uncover how Mozambique became the battlefield of the Cold War and how its people survived the fire. To understand why the Mozambican Civil War began, we must travel back centuries to the roots of colonization. For more than 400 years, Mozambique was under Portuguese rule. The Portuguese arrived in the early 1500s seeking trade routes, wealth, and dominance. They established ports and trading posts across the coastline, forcing local populations into labor, extracting ivory, gold, and eventually slaves. Portuguese colonization was brutal, exploitative, and deeply racist. By the 20th century, Mozambicans had virtually no political rights, no access to quality education, and no voice in their own land. In the rural interior, entire communities were conscripted into forced labor on cotton plantations and colonial farms. Cities were reserved for white settlers, while native Mozambicans were segregated and policed. This system of oppression led to resentment and resistance, which brewed quietly for decades. By the 1950s and 60s, the winds of independence were sweeping through Africa. In Algeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Congo, African people were rising against European powers. In Mozambique, young intellectuals, activists, and freedom fighters began organizing in exile and underground. In 1962, 3 nationalist groups merged to form FRELIMO, the Mozambique Liberation Front. Led initially by Eduardo Mondlane, a US-educated sociologist, FRELIMO launched a guerrilla war against Portuguese forces in 1964.
Mondlane was assassinated in 1969 under mysterious circumstances, but leadership passed to Samora Machel, a charismatic military commander. Under Machel's command, FRELIMO increased its attacks, especially in the northern provinces, where the population supported them. Portugal fought back with brutal counterinsurgency measures, but their resolve was crumbling. Back home in Portugal, a revolution in 1974 overthrew the dictatorship and led to decolonization. On June 25, 1975, Mozambique declared independence. Samora Machel became president, and the country became a one-party Marxist state allied with the Soviet Union. Mozambicans danced in the streets, celebrating freedom. But beneath the celebration lay deep fractures. FRELIMO's socialist policies dismantled traditional power structures, nationalized land, and banned religion. Thousands of Portuguese settlers fled the country, leaving a power vacuum and an economy in chaos. Mozambique was now free, but it was vulnerable, divided, and bleeding from the wounds of history. And it would not be long before a new and darker war began.
It was the year 1977. Just 2 years after Mozambique had gained independence from Portuguese colonial rule. While the country was still learning to walk as a free nation, it was already beginning to stumble. Amid economic collapse, food shortages, and sweeping social changes, a new shadow began to rise in the countryside. This shadow would become RENAMO, the Mozambique National Resistance, a rebel movement that would challenge the authority of the ruling FRELIMO party and drag the country into one of Africa's longest and deadliest civil wars. RENAMO was not born out of thin air. Its origins can be traced to neighboring Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where white minority rulers feared the influence of Mozambique's support for liberation movements. FRELIMO had provided safe haven for fighters of the Zimbabwe African National Union who were battling Rhodesian rule. In response, Rhodesian intelligence services began training, arming, and financing a small group of Mozambican dissidents. Their goal was to destabilize the FRELIMO government and force it to abandon support for regional liberation struggles. This group evolved into RENAMO, and its first leader was Andre Matsangaisa, a former FRELIMO soldier who had been imprisoned for disciplinary issues. He was broken out of jail and taken to Rhodesia, where he was installed as the head of the new movement. With weapons, money, and logistical support from Rhodesia, RENAMO launched its first attacks in central Mozambique, targeting roads, villages, and government installations. Though initially small, RENAMO quickly gained momentum. When Rhodesia collapsed and became Zimbabwe in 1980, RENAMO found a new sponsor in South Africa's apartheid regime. South Africa had its own reasons for wanting Mozambique weak and unstable. Mozambique under FRELIMO was a vocal critic of apartheid and supported the African National Congress in its struggle.
South African military forces set up bases in RENAMO-controlled areas, provided arms and intelligence, and helped the group expand its operations across the country. By the early 1980s, RENAMO was no longer a minor insurgency. It had become a powerful rebel army, capable of carrying out large-scale attacks on towns, power lines, trains, and civilian populations. Unlike traditional armies, RENAMO often operated in small, mobile units, hiding in forests and mountains and striking by surprise. They targeted schools, health clinics, farms, and transportation routes, trying to paralyze the state and undermine public confidence in FRELIMO. Villagers were kidnapped and forced to support the rebels. Young boys were turned into child soldiers. Girls were subjected to horrific abuse. Entire communities were burned to the ground as warnings. FRELIMO responded with its own military campaigns, using the Mozambican army, known as FAM, to hunt down and destroy RENAMO bases. But the army was poorly trained, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Many soldiers were conscripts fighting far from home. The government introduced collective villages in an attempt to isolate the rebels. But this policy often caused more resentment and chaos. By the mid-1980s, the war had spread to all provinces. No corner of Mozambique was safe. From the northern provinces of Nampula and Cabo Delgado to the central region of Zambezia and the southern provinces of Gaza and Inhambane, every region bore the scars of battle. RENAMO's tactics were ruthless and designed to sow terror. They derailed trains carrying supplies, ambushed convoys, planted landmines on rural roads, and executed those suspected of collaborating with FRELIMO. In some cases, entire busloads of people were slaughtered on suspicion of being government sympathizers. At the same time, RENAMO broadcast propaganda over clandestine radio stations, accusing the government of tyranny and betrayal. FRELIMO held on to the cities and major roads, but RENAMO controlled vast swaths of the countryside. The government accused RENAMO of being nothing more than a puppet of foreign powers. RENAMO claimed to be a movement for democracy, freedom, and traditional values. But for most Mozambicans caught in the crossfire, it did not matter who was right. What mattered was survival. Food became scarce. Markets closed. Schools were abandoned. Hospitals were looted. Families lived in constant fear of attack from either side. The nation was crumbling from within, and with each passing year, the war grew more entrenched, more personal, and more hopeless. What had started as a political rebellion had become a national nightmare, and yet the worst was still to come.
As Mozambique burned in the grip of civil war, the rest of the world watched, some in silence, some with intervention, and some with hidden agendas. This was not just an internal war between two rival factions. It was also a proxy battlefield for greater ideological forces that spanned continents and oceans. To fully grasp the depth of the Mozambican Civil War, we must look beyond its borders. We must look to Moscow, to Washington, to Havana, and to Pretoria.
Mozambique was a nation caught between the hammer and the sickle, the dollar and the rifle. When FRELIMO came to power in 1975, it declared Mozambique a Marxist-Leninist state. The government aligned itself with the Eastern Bloc and embraced socialist ideology. Private property was abolished, land was nationalized, and the state took control of education, health, and economic planning. The Soviet Union, Cuba, East Germany, and other socialist nations rushed to support the new government. They provided military training, engineers, doctors, construction crews, and political advisors. Thousands of Mozambican soldiers were trained in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Cuban doctors worked in rural clinics, and East German experts helped build factories and police forces. The world was divided by the Cold War, and Mozambique had chosen a side. But with that choice came enemies. Western powers, especially the United States, viewed FRELIMO with suspicion. They feared the spread of communism in Africa and saw Mozambique as a potential threat to capitalist influence in the region. Worse still, Mozambique openly supported anti-colonial and anti-apartheid movements in Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. In response, Rhodesia and later apartheid South Africa supported RENAMO with money, weapons, and intelligence. This turned the Civil War into a Cold War chess game. FRELIMO, backed by Moscow. RENAMO, backed by Pretoria. South African commandos operated in Mozambique, attacking infrastructure and allegedly coordinating with RENAMO units. Mozambique's neighbors became both sanctuaries and threats. Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Malawi, and Swaziland all played roles either as allies or conduits for weapons, fighters, and ideology. In 1984, Mozambique and South Africa signed the Incompty Accord, a non-aggression pact that promised to end support for rebel movements on both sides. Mozambique agreed to stop harboring ANC fighters, while South Africa agreed to end its aid to RENAMO. But the accord was broken almost immediately. South African support continued in secret, and RENAMO grew even bolder. The war intensified. By 1985, Mozambique was on the verge of collapse. The socialist economy was failing. The central planning system could not respond to war and famine. Food shortages crippled cities and villages alike. Transportation networks were destroyed. Power stations were sabotaged. Hospitals were abandoned. Desperate for survival, Mozambique turned to the West. In a dramatic shift, the FRELIMO government began economic reforms and opened negotiations with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Mozambique began to privatize parts of its economy, reduce subsidies, and welcome Western aid. This marked the beginning of a slow ideological shift. Though the government remained officially socialist, it moved towards pragmatism in the face of disaster. By the late 1980s, the global Cold War itself was unraveling. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev was retreating from foreign entanglements and slashing aid to client states. Eastern Bloc countries were facing revolutions and collapse. In South Africa, the apartheid regime was under international pressure and preparing for internal reform. In this shifting world order, Mozambique was left exposed. Its foreign sponsors were stepping back. Its enemies were also weakening. And for the first time in years, there was space to consider peace.
But before the war could end, it would reach its most terrifying human cost. The damage done to Mozambique's people would take generations to heal. And as world powers stepped away, the people of Mozambique were left to face the consequences of decisions made in distant capitals.
War is never just about politics or territory. It is about people. And in Mozambique, the people suffered more than the world will ever fully understand. The Mozambican Civil War was not fought in distant deserts or on isolated borders. It was fought in villages, in homes, in schools, and in the very hearts of communities. By the time the war ended in 1992, more than 1 million people had died. Many of these deaths were not from bullets or bombs, but from hunger, disease, and despair. Over 4 million Mozambicans were forced to flee their homes. Some became refugees in neighboring countries like Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. Others became internally displaced, sleeping in forests, hiding in mountains, or seeking shelter in crumbling towns. Entire families were separated. Children grew up never knowing peace. Many never saw their parents again. The trauma etched into the minds of survivors would last a lifetime. The war was marked by widespread use of landmines, which remain buried across the countryside even today. These silent killers have claimed thousands of lives long after the shooting stopped. Farmers were afraid to return to their fields. Children playing in open fields lost limbs or lives. The fear never fully faded. RENAMO and FRELIMO both committed atrocities. Villages were massacred. Civilians were abducted. Women were raped as a weapon of war. Children were forcibly recruited as soldiers. These children, often as young as 10, were given rifles, trained to kill, and turned into instruments of violence. Many were forced to kill their own families or friends under threat of death. The psychological scars from this cruelty are immeasurable. Entire generations grew up with no access to education. Schools were bombed or abandoned. Teachers fled the violence. Students never had textbooks or even desks. Hospitals were targeted or looted. Medical supplies were stolen. Doctors fled or were killed. Diseases like malaria, cholera, and tuberculosis spread rapidly. Malnutrition was widespread, especially among children. The economy collapsed completely. Agricultural production plummeted. Factories closed. Trade routes were cut off. Inflation soared. Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world, became even poorer. The international community struggled to respond. Aid organizations like the Red Cross and the United Nations faced enormous challenges reaching remote areas. Many roads were unsafe, bridges were destroyed, convoys were attacked. Even aid workers became targets. Despite these dangers, brave volunteers continued to work, delivering food, medicine, and hope to people who had lost everything. In some regions, entire populations were living on emergency rations for years at a time. Children were born in war and raised in it. They learned to walk among ruins, to sleep to the sound of gunfire, and to run from helicopters overhead. Generations were shaped by fear. The land itself became a symbol of sorrow. Fields that once grew maize and cassava became killing zones. Rivers that once fed villages now carried the memories of the dead. Mozambicans were not just victims, they were survivors.
In churches and community centers, people came together to mourn, to pray, and to remember. Songs were written to express pain. Stories were passed down as warnings. And through it all, a fragile hope survived. That one day the killing would stop. That one day the war would end. That one day children would return to school. That one day the sound of birds would replace the sound of gunfire. But peace seemed so far away. Even as the Cold War was coming to an end, even as global powers shifted their priorities, even as the world changed, Mozambique remained locked in a nightmare that was becoming unbearable. And yet, even in the darkest hours, small signs of light began to flicker. Peace was no longer just a distant dream. It was slowly becoming a possibility. And soon both sides would have to face the question. After all the bloodshed, all the destruction, all the years lost, could Mozambique be rebuilt?
By the early 1990s, after 15 long years of bloodshed, suffering, and loss, the war that had devastated Mozambique was finally drawing to an end. But peace did not come suddenly. It came slowly through exhaustion, negotiation, and the shifting winds of global politics. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The United States was looking elsewhere. South Africa was preparing for its own transformation away from apartheid. Mozambique could no longer rely on its allies or fear its enemies in the same way. FRELIMO, the ruling party, began to change. In 1989, it formally abandoned Marxism-Leninism, and in 1990, a new constitution was adopted. This constitution introduced multi-party democracy, freedom of speech, and the promise of national elections. It was a major turning point. FRELIMO was no longer a one-party state. It had recognized the need for inclusion, reconciliation, and political change. At the same time, RENAMO, weakened by internal divisions and declining foreign support, was also willing to talk. The war had become unwinnable for both sides. Neither FRELIMO nor RENAMO could claim total victory, but both could still lose everything if the war continued. In 1990, initial peace talks began in Rome, mediated by the Catholic Church and supported by the international community. These negotiations were long, difficult, and filled with mistrust. But eventually, after 2 years of dialogue, both sides signed the General Peace Agreement on October 4, 1992. The guns fell silent. The war was officially over. But Mozambique's journey was far from complete. The country was left in ruins. Over 1 million people had died. Over 4 million had been displaced. Thousands of children had been turned into soldiers. Entire communities had been erased. Bridges, railways, schools, and hospitals had to be rebuilt from scratch. Mines littered the countryside. The process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration began. RENAMO fighters were disarmed, and many returned to civilian life. Others joined the newly integrated National Army. United Nations peacekeepers arrived to monitor the transition.
In 1994, Mozambique held its first multi-party elections. FRELIMO won, and Joaquim Chissano became president. But RENAMO accepted the results and became the official opposition party. This peaceful transition was a major milestone for a country emerging from civil war. Over the next decade, Mozambique slowly began to recover. International aid poured in from the European Union, the United Nations, and the United States. NGOs and humanitarian groups worked to rebuild infrastructure, resettle refugees, and remove landmines. Schools reopened, clinics were rebuilt, markets returned. The economy began to grow. Mozambicans returned to their fields, to their homes, to their lives. But the scars of war remained. Post-traumatic stress, poverty, political tension, and distrust continued to haunt the nation. Reintegration was not easy. Some former fighters struggled to find jobs. Some communities feared the return of armed men. But despite these challenges, Mozambique moved forward. It became one of Africa's quiet success stories. The peace held, democracy continued, and a generation born in war grew up in peace. Today, Mozambique is still facing challenges. In recent years, violence has returned in the north, where extremist groups have launched deadly attacks. Poverty remains widespread. Natural disasters such as cyclones and floods test the resilience of the people. And political divisions still exist. But the legacy of peace, the memory of war, and the strength of the Mozambican people continue to define the nation. The Mozambique Civil War was a tragedy of epic proportions, but it also became a story of resilience, courage, and the possibility of healing. It teaches us that the price of power is high, that ideology without compassion leads to ruin, and that peace is never given. It is built day by day, year by year, by the hands and hearts of ordinary people. Mozambique survived, and that survival is a testament not to armies or governments, but to the people who refused to give up. This is their story. This is their history. And this must never be forgotten.